This is a lecture by Donald Livingston. Now, he comes off smug, and I really don't like that. It gets on my nerves. But he says some interesting things about slavery, and also I've come across the same things during my research. So just listen.
Good morning. Trust that God gave you a good rest, and we're ready to spend a rather heavy morning considering what happened in this part of the country, or at least in what I call our country, when the other country invaded us. This is the quote of the day. Now, the quote of the day from Wendell Phillips, abolitionist, probably the most prominent spokesman for the abolitionist. One half of history is loose conjecture, and much of the rest is the writer's opinion. Most men see facts, not with their eyes, but with their prejudices. Most men see facts, not with their eyes, but with their prejudices. And I can tell you, Wendell Phillips ought to know, because that's exactly the way he saw the facts. This morning, I want to address you on the issue of slavery, a topic that most Southerners are never supposed to open their mouths about. It's a topic that we are supposed to be very much ashamed about and cover our heads. And I am not here to say that it's something we ought to be proud about. What I am here to say is what you've been told about slavery is not the truth. The South has long carried the stigma of racism and bigotry, and the fact that slavery only ended because the South lost the war has served to reinforce this common stereotype. And so for this reason, many Southerners take little pride in our section's role in the war between the states, or our nation's role. The only thing that most Southerners boast about is the way we fought. And of course, the way we fought is praiseworthy. I'm not at all going to denounce that. But it's sad to me that we don't talk of principle and righteousness and truth. And the reason why we don't is because we have been trained to think and told to think over and over again that the South might have been ferocious fighters, but they were not righteous. It was wrong what was being done. And the thing that has prevented us from opening our mouths on these areas and speaking of principle and righteousness and truth has been the issue of slavery. How could anyone like Stonewall Jackson fight for slavery, people ask me. Robert E. Lee was a great man. Why would he fight for slavery, I've been told? Well, and especially after someone hears what I, and perhaps you as well, will say, that the South was a pervasively Christian culture, they have a bigger question then. Why would a pervasively Christian culture defend slavery? We have all heard of the brutalities, the immoralities, the cruelties, and the heartlessness that was supposedly inherent in the system of slavery. We have heard of the breaking up of slave families, the forcible rape of slave women, the brutal beatings that were, they say, commonplace, the horrible living conditions, the unrelenting work schedule, the back-breaking routine, all of which, they say, go together to form the crushing oppression that was slavery in the South. One historian said it was a condition that shames the modern world. And the truth is, Southern slavery is open to criticism because it did not follow the biblical pattern at every point. It was not voluntary but coercive. It was not purely punitive. There were laws against abusing slaves and killing them without just cause, but not always were these laws as specific as they could have been. No one can defend the abuse that slaves endured from time to time. No one better ever excuse the immorality that some masters indulged in. No one can justify the laws against teaching black men and women to read and write, or the separation of families that sometimes occurred. These were sad realities, and my purpose in this hour is not at all to condone any of that where it occurred. I have no interest in defending racism, which underlay and undergirded the system and pervaded North and South. and I trust that you would agree as well. The question, however, needs to be asked, how widespread were the instances of unbiblical and ungodly treatment on the part of Southern slaveholders? Were these abuses commonplace, or were they exceptional? And my concern in this hour is to lay out the facts that are not spoken in public anymore. It's the thing that most people, I'm afraid of, that they're afraid to talk about. And so it needs to be talked about. The truth of slavery has yet to be widely disseminated. And as a consequence, there's been a great deal of falsehood which is paraded about in the clothing of truth, some of it on video that you have seen over and over and over again. They will never quit running Ken Burns' rendition and Ken Burns' legend of the Civil War. It's become now, you see, what he said was mostly mythology, but it's becoming fact the more it's played, and it's continuously played. Honestly, it's like Black History Month. We never get out of Black History Month. Every month is Black History Month. Ken Burns, every month is the Civil War by Ken Burns somewhere along the line. Well, you repeat a lie long enough and it becomes the truth in most men's mind. The South has been stigmatized and slandered for generations, and generations of Southern children have been misled over the true nature of the peculiar institution, and as a consequence, over the truth about the South in general. We must know the truth about slavery. I am not concerned to whitewash the sins of the South. I think they need to be acknowledged and repented of. I'm not concerned to whitewash the sins of the North either. They need to be acknowledged and repented of. But let the record be truthful. At least, where there's sin, we freely confess it and forsake it. But let not lies hold the place of truth any longer. So, let's begin by thinking about the nature of slavery in the South. The first thing that has to be remembered is that slavery was not widespread. Only 8 to 16% of the families of the South ever owned even one slave. Most people in the South never owned slaves. My family didn't. Most likely, your family didn't, unless it was an unusually wealthy or well-off family in some way. Most people in the South were not slave owners. I think over 80%, but at least 80%. And so we're talking about a very small percentage of the population who owned any slaves. Now, of that percentage who did own slaves, fully 86% of them owned 5 or fewer. So you're talking now about a very small percentage when you think about the movies with a big plantation house and long rows of slave houses. That was most unusual. It was not typical. My family, I don't think, if they didn't tell me if they ever had a big house like that, and if they do, I want to know about it. We didn't own a big house. Our family was poor, and very likely your family was as well. Most people in the South were not wealthy, although they worked hard. They were honest and honorable people, but they were not wealthy people. We're talking about a very small percentage of the population, but let's not use that as an excuse. Let's talk about that very small percentage, and the question about that percentage needs to be asked. And here's the question. If slavery was as bad as the abolitionists say it was, and they continue to say it was, as we have been told supposedly on good authority, my question is, why were there not thousands of slave rebellions? Not just a few, which was what happened. There were a handful of slave rebellions, but if slavery was like the abolitionists have told us, I want to know why there weren't thousands and why everybody in the South weren't up in arms about this. What was wrong? Has there ever been a culture that could tolerate that kind of ungodliness? These questions have not been asked, I don't think, loudly or often enough. The question, and I think the reason why they haven't been asked is because the answer would probably shock and dismay the vast majority of our nation who've been reared on abolitionist propaganda. The peculiar institution was not perfect or sinless, but the reality was a far sight less horrific than the descriptions we've been given. And most of what you read in modern history books are nothing other than a reworking of abolitionist propaganda that had the slimmest connection with the truth. The South was visited many times by journalists from the North as well as from Europe in order to send back first-hand reports on the nature of the South in general and the nature of slavery in particular. In the 1840s, the Englishman Charles Lyell traveled through the nation and published the results of his observations in a book called Travels in North America in the years 1841 and 1842. Lyell's description of slavery as it operated in the South were widely publicized in the North and pointedly contradicted the prevalent abolitionist propaganda. Lyell noted the remarkable affection that existed between the races in the South. He was amazed that there was so much affection between master and slave. He noted the fact that he found slaves better fed, he said, than a large part of the laboring class of Europe. He said there were no whips or chains or gross mistreatment. Now, he didn't see everything, but that was his observation. As far as he saw, he didn't see the kind of mistreatment that he had been led to expect. To Lyell, slavery was a rather mild institution, though he felt very uneconomical and inefficient. Now, this view was confirmed by many others, including fellow Britisher, the Earl of Carlisle, James Strickland, and by American Northerner, Frederick Law Olmsted, who was staunchly anti-slavery and very much prejudiced against the South. But this testimony was ignored in favor of abolitionist rant. The people of the North in the 19th century ignored facts in favor of emotionalism. But they're not the only ones to ignore the facts. Let's not fall into a self-righteous condemnation, for in fact, people of our day continue to do the same. One of the most ignored documents in the Library of Congress, and I assure you, to say this is to say a great deal, because there are many, many ignored and obscure documents in the Library of Congress, especially today. In fact, when I called the Library of Congress and asked about this, the person that I talked to was supposedly one of the assistant librarians up there, had never heard of what I was asking. And they searched and they did find a copy after a while. But one of the most obscure documents is the slave narratives. Those were, this was the result of a federal works project during the Depression, where a number of out-of-work writers were employed by the federal government to travel through the South, or in some cases Southern journalists were hired to interview former slaves who were living during that time, to ask them about the conditions of slavery, to get a first-hand account of what slavery was like. Now, one would think that the verbal testimony of over 2,300 slaves, former slaves, would be a fairly important piece of information if you want to get a picture of slavery in the South. You would think, but I would guess that many of you have never heard of the slave narratives, nor even knew that they existed. For the fact is, after they were compiled, they were buried and continued to be denounced every time somebody raises the issue of the slave narratives. People are surprised by that, but you shouldn't be. The fact is that historians are not neutral, nor are they normally led about by the facts. They see the facts not with their eyes, but with their prejudices. And so the slave narratives have had very little effect upon modern historiography of this period, and the reason is because consistently the narratives portray an amazingly, to our modern eyes, an amazingly benign picture of Southern plantation life. Affection for former masters and mistresses is expressed in terms of unmistakable devotion. Testimony to the good treatment and kindness and gentleness of many so-called heartless slave owners abounds. Many of the old slaves express a wistful desire to get back and go back to the plantation. Slave life to them, according to their own words, was a life of plenty, of simple pleasures, of food and clothes and good medical care. There is no pervasive cry of rage and anguish. There is no general expression of bitterness or outrage. Instead, what you find on page after page are protestations of affection for a condition that most of us have thought every slave despised. Overwhelmingly, there is a positive view of slavery set forth, and it is all the more striking when one considers that these interviews took place in the years that we would think were the most harsh years of slavery. I think they were the worst years of slavery. Now, as you can imagine, modern abolitionists have fallen over themselves in an effort to discredit this amazing testimony. Here's some of the critique, some of the arguments they use against to discredit the slave narratives. They say that these people were old, and old people don't have good memories. They say, well, they were suffering under the Great Depression, and people who were living under those times, they naturally would think that other times were better. Or they say they were talking to white people, and they were afraid to say things that might get them in trouble with the white people. Now, these efforts to explain away the overall testimony of the narratives fall to the ground. And let me give you my opinion as to why they do. First of all, the testimony is not unanimous. In other words, there are those, they are in a distinct minority, but there are those who mention terrible atrocities, horrifying things that when I read them, I could not read them without crying. Horrifying atrocities. They complain about meanness and immorality. They are very bitter about how they had to live during those days. They were not too old to remember the mistreatment that they received and they observed. They were not too old by a long shot, nor were they intimidated by the white person in their house asking them these questions. In fact, I think it's a rather racist thing to imply that black people are always intimidated by white people. That isn't always the case. One older lady, as she was being interviewed by a young white woman in her house, stopped the interview and looked at the white woman who was sitting across in her room and said, "Now, dear, I have one question to ask you. Is you a Christian?" And the white reporter said, "I hope so." And the black lady said, "Well, I sure hope so too, because you is too fine looking to go to hell." I dare say she was not intimidated by the presence of this woman. And there is wonderful candidness in these things many times. Now, were they sometimes exaggerated? No doubt about it. They describe sometimes scenes that they don't happen in this life, some of the things. Also, I think not only were the favorable descriptions exaggerated from time to time, but we must also recognize that some of the harsh treatment was exaggerated as well. There's sometimes men say things that happen to them that if indeed they did happen to them, it would be impossible to survive it. They describe such horrible things, it just simply couldn't be true. So you do have exaggerations. You do have misrepresentation. You do have lies in there. You would in any kind of document like that. The question is that the character of these narratives? And I don't think the answer is that that's the character. It isn't. The fact that they were quite happy for the opportunity to speak about slavery is clear. Their testimony, that is, this contrary testimony, the testimony of the negative side of slavery, I think, gives a legitimacy and an authenticity to the narratives that they might lack otherwise. There was mistreatment. There were atrocities. There was a great deal of wickedness on the part of some. But as the narratives make plain, these were a distinct and a very small minority. R.L. Dabney, William S. White, Charles Colcock Jones. If you don't know the latter two, you need to know them. Joe mentioned yesterday evening William S. White, Stonewall Jackson's pastor at the Presbyterian Church in Lexington, Virginia. Charles Colcock Jones was a Georgian, at least served at Midway Church, and very prominent in his work among black slaves. Wrote a book that has been republished by the Krause Publications entitled The Religious Instruction of the Negro. Very important work, and Charles Colcock Jones was always an advocate for the instruction and education of black slaves in the South. But these men and many other defenders of the South also acknowledged the existence of mistreatment and wickedness among some of the slaveholders. The South did not ignore this. They maintained, however, that these instances were relatively rare and infrequent. Dabney says this: Now, while we freely admit that there were in the South instances of criminal barbarity in corporal punishments, they were very infrequent and were sternly reprobated by public opinion. The last part is very important. These men, many of them were brought to trial and convicted for what they did to their slaves. Presbyterian pastor William S. White observed this: "In all lands there are husbands and fathers who maltreat their wives and children. So there are masters among us who maltreat their slaves. But the prevailing spirit is one of great kindness, showing itself in innumerable ways. Their mutual dependence begets a mutual attachment. I could fill volumes with incidents occurring under my eyes, illustrating this statement. But," he says, this is in his book, his autobiography, "but," he says, "I write this for my own people, especially my own children, and not for the abolitionist." Now you see, this judgment is confirmed and has been confirmed in a most powerful way in a rather recent publication that again has been buried by the modern academia. It's the publication entitled Time on the Cross. And if you've not read that book, you do not, and you can't, I'm sorry to say, obtain it now. It's not in print, and it may not ever get back in print unless we reprint it. But Time on the Cross was written by two northern professors, Robert William Fogel and Stanley L. Ingerman. They were professors of economics and history at the time of the writing of the book, and Professor Fogel taught at Harvard University. The book sent shockwaves through the academic world when it was published in the early 70s, 1974. And it still gives a wonderful shock when mentioned. And that's why I love to mention it at every opportunity. These two men did perhaps, or without question, the most thorough examination that has ever been done of plantation records. The owner of the plantation's personal record books. Now, the reason why they went through the plantation records was they believed that regardless of what a man might say publicly, the books, the bottom line, would tell the truth. We don't want to know what a man said for public consumption. We want to know exactly what his records show. How were his slaves treated? What kind of clothes did they wear? What kind of food did they eat? What kind of housing did they have? What about medical care? What about his treatment of them? What are the records, and what do the records say? They felt that that would be the most unbiased picture of the Southern institution. And again, these men are not favorable toward the South. They are not favorable toward slavery. And in their book, you will notice that they very much apologize for their findings. Was there cruelty is the first question. And the thing that they wanted to concern was the methods of punishment. And their conclusion was this: though there were other forms of punishment used, the most common form of punishment was whipping. Some whippings were so severe they resulted in death. In other instances, which were by far the majority, the whippings were applied as mildly as corporal punishment is normally practiced within families. You must remember that the slaves were viewed as family members, especially among Christians. You always chasten your children. I spank mine, and if yours are in my house, they might get one too if they deserve it. That's the way we live. We believe that that's important. And so the Southern slave owner, Christian slave owner, was very concerned about the training and discipline of all of his children. That's the way he referred to his slaves. And so very often he himself would do it. He did not allow overseers to whip because he felt that their frustrations might be carried out. Many times the whipping was only allowed to be done in the presence of the slave, presence of the master. Many times the slaves themselves, as a slave jury, determined how many whippings had to be given. And the master always, one man said, I always had to cut it by half. In other words, it was always too severe, the judgment of the slaves on themselves, on their offenders. The slave narratives are overwhelmingly favorable in the judgment of masters as good men. And I mean by that is that I've read approximately 40% of the slave testimonies. It is a very wide sample, much more, I would say, wider than most samples taken in common polls. And I have a list of conclusions from that. And I only counted a testimony if they specifically mentioned the nature of the master and his treatment. Now, many times slaves would say things like, it was a wonderful time in slave days. I had a wonderful time. Now, I assume by that statement they weren't mistreated, but I didn't count them because they didn't say they weren't mistreated. You see? So I try to get a very conservative kind of number. Now, 86% of those that I read said that they were never mistreated, that their masters were very kind and loving, granting many privileges, and they loved them and love them still. Now, quite a few, as I mentioned, would not allow whipping at all, and only allowed it very mildly and only in their presence. Far more important, you see, than whipping was managing the slave, and managing the slaves was trying to motivate them. You see, you have to understand again that no plantation owner wanted slaves that were sullen and discontented and hostile, as you could have been if you're mistreating them. You see, let's get honest. Even if I'm not a Christian, Christians obviously were concerned about how they treated their slaves. But even if I'm not a Christian, I've got a lot of money invested in these people. I do not want them angry with me. I do not want them sabotaging the plantation, and there were literally thousands of ways that slaves could sabotage the intricate system of a plantation. If you upset one of them, they could destroy thousands of dollars. I mean, you could lose thousands of dollars. Even if I'm not a Christian, I am concerned about my money. I'm concerned about my investment. And that alone kept many men from mistreating slaves because they knew what slaves could do to sabotage the work of the plantation. You don't want sullen, discontented, angry, and hostile men working for you. Rather, you want happy, honest, responsible men who identify their fortunes with yours. And so what you want to do is to win their confidence and win their affection. The problem that Southerners had was motivating and encouraging. They did not do by and large, a great deal of negative punishment because they were afraid of the reaction. There were too many ways to do you wrong. So to achieve the desired response, planners developed a wide-ranging system of rewards. Some rewards were directed toward improving the short-run performance, so they'd have contests. Whoever gets through the row fastest wins an extra piece of lunch or something. You know, there's little contests like that, and so they would have these races. They'd have corn shucking contests. They'd have all kinds of things. The prizes for the individual or the particular crew that worked together range from anything from clothing to tobacco to whiskey, but most often cash. When slaves worked times that were normally set aside for rest, they received extra pay. Most slaves in the South were paid at some point or another for their work. Occasionally, planners even devised elaborate schemes for profit sharing among their slaves. It was just like a factory almost, where you encourage and motivate your workers by saying, if we have a good crop, all of you get rewards. And that's what they did. It was rather elaborate, and the formula were all in the books, and they were written out. Now, all this evidence points to the fact that slaves lived at various levels of income. The average pecuniary income actually received by a prime field hand was roughly 15% greater than the income he would have received for his labor as a free agricultural worker, which is why most of the Southern non-slave owners were very much opposed to slavery. They didn't feel like it was fair to them. Occasionally, some slaves saved their money and were quite wealthy after the war. Simon Phillips, a slave from Alabama, says this: "People has the wrong idea of slave days. We was treated good. My master never laid a hand on me the whole time I was with him, and sometime we loaned him money when he was hard pushed." As far as the freemen in the South, and there were quite a few freemen, many slaves purchased their freedom, and a lot of them were encouraged to do that very thing, which is something, again, you don't hear. The data in the 1850 census suggests that the economic condition of the average free northern Negro may have been worse than that of the average free southern Negro. A comparison between New York and New Orleans reveals that New York Negroes lived in more crowded housing, had a lower proportion of craftsmen, less wealth per capita than free Negroes in New Orleans. Nearly every slave in the South enjoyed a higher standard of living than the poor whites in the South. And they had a much easier existence. Most slaves worked under the task system, which allowed a great deal of flexibility in your work. And usually, in other words, you had a specific task to accomplish, and it didn't matter when you accomplished it so much as it had to be accomplished this day. If you could do it in a couple hours, you were finished. You finished your task. Sometimes it would take 8 hours, sometimes it would take 4 hours, and the average task took between 3 and 5 hours. It didn't take you all day long. Now, they'll talk about working from sun to sun up to sundown. But in fact, white masters got up at sunup and went to bed at sundown. Everybody, by and large in the South, worked the same way. The average slave owner, of course, got up with his slaves, went to the field with his slaves, ate lunch with his slaves, and sometimes slept in the same room with his slaves in the evening because they all lived in the same house. So that was not unusual. But normally, and Forrest McDonald, historian at the University of Alabama, says this, normally these tasks were light enough that a worker could complete them in 3 to 4 hours. His time was his own when his task was done. And it was not uncommon for slaves in their free time to work the acres that were uniformly allotted to them by their masters and thereby allowed to accumulate personal property. In fact, if I can stop for a moment, every slave that I have read of had a private plot that was given to him by his master on which he grew vegetables, and the master bought the vegetables from the slave. Now, you see, in my mind, I thought, look, he could legitimately say, this is my land that you're farming, so you give me a portion of it. In fact, most masters purchased the produce that was produced by the slaves, or allowed the slaves to take it to town and sell it on their own, to teach them again the importance of private property and how important it is to work, and how God rewards faithful men who labor diligently. And so many slaves were working their own fields. When you got finished with your task, you went home and you worked, sometimes late into the night, but it was on your own property, or at least the property that was allotted to you by the master, and you were working for yourself at that time, and that's why they worked very hard. A lot of these black men were extremely diligent, extremely hardworking, very gifted men, most honorable, and I bow to them. It was more common for slaves to double up on their work. Forrest McDonald is saying this. To do even 2 or 3 tasks in a day and then to take several days off, in which they might travel many miles by horse or boat to visit friends or family or lovers on other plantations. And again, the slave narratives confirm this. They would often take very long trips. There's an account of one slave who took off 3 months and took a tour of the United States. And writing home these cards, wish you were here. It's quite wonderful. They went around. But these were hardworking. Not everyone had that kind of diligence. These men were very hardworking and had their money to spend when they took their family on a vacation. Was there the breaking up of slave families for profit? On average, only one slaveholder out of every 22 sold a slave in any given year. 1 out of 22. And roughly a third of those who did sell slaves were sold because the man had died and his estate demanded that they be sold. The trading did occur, and as a result, some families were broken up. The question is, how widespread was this? If you have seen Roots, you say it happened every day. That's the way it was. Every time these masters got a man and his wife together and let them get a little bit attached, well, they'd split them up. That's the impression that a lot of people had. Well, think about it. Does that promote nice, harmonious working conditions? It doesn't. Even the unbelievers didn't like to do this because of the results. A very sad husband, a very grieving and moping woman. You did not want that. You didn't want the morality of your plantation drugged down by somebody who was hurt because they thought you'd done them wrong. That just didn't happen. Data contained on the sales records of New Orleans, and New Orleans was by far the largest market in the interregional slave trade, sharply contradict the popular view that the destruction of slave marriages was at least frequent, if not universal. These records, which cover thousands of transactions during the years from 1804 to 1862, indicate 2% of the marriages of slaves involved in the westward migration. Many times slaveholders in the East were selling slaves to the West, which was where the boom was going on, you see. And so the westward migration, which was the occasion for the interregional slave trade, that 2% of the slave marriages were broken up. Now, you say, boy, 2% though, all right, but it was the same percentage for white marriages that broke up in the westward migration. Many women didn't want to go out in the frontier. White marriages had the same percentage of breakup. Now, you say, well, it wasn't forcible. Well, true, but many times the slave breakup wasn't forcible either. The slave wife wouldn't want to go, and so the man did. There is no reason to believe that the age and sex structure of interstate sales in New Orleans was markedly different from other South Central cities. New Orleans, more than any other city, dominated the interregional slave trade in receiving about 1/3 of the slaves sold between states. But someone else says, well, wait a minute, wasn't there an effort to breed slaves for profit? I mean, there were just these stud farms all over where they just had babies and raised them up and sold them for profit. That was a big business. Well, that thesis and rumor has circulated, and many historians have searched for this. And it implies a couple of things. I want you to think about it. This thesis involves a couple of interrelated concepts. It involves the interference in the normal sexual habits of human beings to maximize female fertility through such devices as mating women with especially potent men. And it involves, secondly, the raising of slaves for sale as the main motive. Now, let's think about that for a moment. Many thousands of hours have been extended in trying to produce documented evidence of a stud farm, which is what this would be. And not a single instance of such a thing existing has ever been found. Nor was the sale of slaves that profitable. That's the other side of it. The sweet potato crop brought in more income to slave owners than selling their slaves. Furthermore, proponents of this breeding thesis have been misled by their failure to recognize the difference between human beings and animals. It is inherently racist, in my view, to imply that black people are different from white people. And what we know about normal people, all men, is that promiscuity does not increase fertility, but rather it decreases fertility. What increases fertility among animals decreases fertility among men. Promiscuity causes, of course, disease. That decreases fertility. One of the things that scientists will tell you, I'm not talking about Christian, of course, from a Christian perspective, we know the same thing is true. God does not commonly bless promiscuity with children. Emotional factors are of considerable significance, scientists say. And I'm speaking now in scientific terms. We're pretending to be neutral now, you see. I got to do this every now and then just to feel what it's like, you know. They say emotional factors are considerable significance in successful human conception, and doesn't that sound very scientific? You see, to imply that these factors are not present in black people is racist, and I accuse the abolitionists of being racist publicly because they imply that black people are not human. By this kind of thesis, I denounce them. Most planners shunned direct interference in sexual practices and attempted to influence fertility pattern only with the encouragements that you would normally do to your friends. That is to say, saying it's a wonderful thing to have babies. It's a good thing. God bless you. Instructions from slave owners to their overseers frequently contain warnings against undue familiarity, and every overseer knew what the owner meant by that, which might undermine slave morale and discipline. No set of instructions to overseers has been uncovered which explicitly or implicitly encouraged selective breeding or promiscuity. Now, did it happen sometimes? Yes. Was it widespread? No. Wicked men do wicked things. We will not. I will never defend this kind of wickedness when you find it. But I challenge you to say that was common in the South. It simply was not common. Wasn't sexual exploitation so frequent that it undermined and destroyed the black family, people say? Well, critics of the South have always said that. They accuse slave owners and overseers of turning plantations into personal harems. The evidence, however, on which that charge is based is very slim to be charitable. It is extremely slim. Such arguments overlook the real and potentially large costs that confronted masters and overseers who sought sexual pleasures in the slave quarters. You got to think for a minute. If you're a rich planter, do you really want to go into the slave quarters, take a man's wife or a father's daughter, when every slave is going to know about this, and somebody's going to tell your wife, you really want to do that? You really want your reputation to be that spoken about in town like that? No, you see, what did these ungodly men do? It's far easier to keep a mistress in town where nobody might find out. If that's what you want to do, then that's the way you do it. You don't go roaming around the slave quarters. It's a ridiculous kind of accusation to say that this happened over and over again. Did it happen? Yes. And we abominate it. And the South, by and large, thought it was a horrible, horrible thing. But did it happen often? No. Was it widespread? No. Because it was too risky. Even if you weren't a Christian and didn't have convictions against immorality, you just cared more about your reputation and your business to do that. You didn't want your wife beating you with a frying pan. And Southern women did it. They did it. They chased these men out. God bless them. Beat those dogs, you know. Amen. You see, for the overseer, the cost of sexual episodes for the slave quarters, once discovered, was his job. Overseers were fired more for this than any other reason, because a master did not want a man who would do that kind of thing and undermine the morale of the slaves. Remember, again, this is a racist kind of thing to say that black men didn't care about their women and would allow them to sleep around. Black men love their women just as much as we do, and there is no man who likes to know that his wife is with many men around him if he has any true masculinity about him at all. And it's racist to imply that black men just kind of sat back and let all this happen. No, black men didn't. Many times black men kill the adulterer. And I say again, I understand. Black men were sometimes put on trial for doing it and were acquitted when it was learned that in fact they were retaliating because of adultery. Not always was that the case, but it did happen. Now, all these things also, in addition, and this is one of the most important points that I want to make, is that they overlook the strength of the slave family. Planters promoted strong families, not merely because it was biblical, which was the motivation for many, but also because that meant if everybody's happy, that's good. That's good for the plantation. And happy families make happy workers. And if I'm an ungodly man, if the only thing I really love is money, I still want happy families. Because happy families make happy workers. Whistle while you work, boys. This is great. We work all day when we're happy. We like to do it. You see, even ungodly men encouraged very strong families. Marriage was encouraged and honored in spite of the abolitionist propaganda that says it was not always honored. No, it wasn't legal under all circumstances, but it was still honored by the masters. Adultery was punished. Divorce was discouraged by the whip. And an adulterer who got caught was in big trouble. Furthermore, slave families were not matriarchal, as we have been told. What abolitionists are doing is looking at the modern black family and assuming that's the way black families have always been. That's racist, incidentally. Because the fact is that the men were the head of their houses under the slave system. The men were men, and the women were women. It's a beautiful thing to see the ladylike femininity of the slave women and the masculinity of the slave men. The husband was the head of the house. There was a strong familial bond. The children were disciplined and well trained. This kind of bond is not the product of promiscuity. One might almost say, and I will say, that the black family has never been stronger than it was under slavery. Someone else says, weren't the living conditions just terrible? Well, let's think about it. The food, for example. The belief that the typical slave was poorly fed is without foundation totally. There was no deficiency in the amount of meat allotted to slaves. On the average, they consumed 6 ounces of meat per day, which is 1 ounce lower than the average quantity of meat consumed by the free population. The high consumption of meat and sweet potatoes and peas made the slave diet not only adequate, but in fact it actually exceeded the recommended daily... I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh at this. But the truth is it exceeded the recommended daily levels of the chief nutrients by a long shot. And again, even unbelieving men, you don't want malnourished men. They can't work. See, this is the contradiction in all of these criticisms should be manifest to us. Even if I am an ungodly man, I want my workers well fed. Because if they're not well fed, they can't work. And if they can't work, I ain't going to make any money. Now you see, let's forget about Christians for a moment, even though I will contend that most of these men were essentially Christian men. And they had other motives aside from just the material. But let's just say they just had material motives. Even a material motive moves you to treat your slaves better than the abolitionists said they were treated. No, they were well fed. Clothing was not lavish, but it was fairly standard for the average white man in the South. And many slaves, truth be told, had far better clothes than poor whites. Shelter, what about their houses? Weren't they just terrible? Well, the most systematic housing information comes from the 1860 census, which included a count of slave houses. These data show that on average there were 5.2 slaves per house. Now, I got more people in my house than that. Mine's a little bigger. But the fact is, the average free household had 5.3 people in it. Single-family housing was the norm. You didn't have 3 and 4 families in a little outhouse kind of building. The average slave house was 18 by 20. They usually had 1 or 2 rooms. Lofts were very common where the children slept. Windows, sometimes even glazed windows, most times windows that were closed with shutters, were there. Chimneys were there of brick or stone, not twigs and mud, because those things, of course, burn up, and you don't do things that are dangerous around people that you care about, number one, or people that you've got a big investment in, number two. Building material was either logs or wood, which was common, of course, in all free housing. Floors were planked and raised off the ground. This is the average slave home. They weren't dirt floors because of disease and all the other things. They were planked floors, usually raised off the ground for all the reasons we do that today. Such housing may sound rather common to modern standards, but actually it compared very well with the homes of free workers in the antebellum era. I have 2 photographs, and I didn't bring them, but one of them is of a slave house, and the other one is of a normal white, average white citizen's house. They look identical because, in fact, many times the typical slave cabin was a little nicer than the average white family's house in the South. Poor whites were much worse, and some of the slaves in the slave narratives complain because after slavery they say, we're having to live like poor white people. The typical slave cabin contained more sleeping space per person than was available to the working class in New York City in 1900. What about medical care? Well, generally the slaves received the same medical care the family received. The same doctor ministered to the planter's family as ministered to the slave family. Good medical care is reflected in the statistics for life expectancy. U.S. slaves had much longer life expectancy than free urban industrial workers in the North and in Europe. The life expectancy of a Southern slave was far, far longer because they were treated better than Northern industrial workers and European workers. Now, okay, given those facts, let's return now and say, what were the problems of slavery? Well, the Southerners were very quick to say, slavery is attended with many evils. It is not of itself an evil, but it is attended with many evils. What they were saying was slavery is a righteous institution, it is a biblical institution when it operates biblically. Unfortunately, Southern slavery did not operate biblically at every point, and so it was not perfect and was worthy of criticism. But you see, too often the problems of slavery are not the problems we've been told about. Let me just mention a few of the problems. Obviously, we should be quick, and Christians in the South have always been quick to notice those discrepancies between biblical slavery and Southern slavery. Those differences make an unqualified defense of the institution as it existed and operated in the South impossible. We cannot defend it because of its unbiblical characteristics. Furthermore, the cruel mistreatment given to some slaves is inexcusable, and I will say despicable, and I denounce the whole thing. That mistreatment was reprobated, however, by the majority of Southern slave owners and Southerners in general. All of this sort of thing that occurred was wicked. It was indefensible. We will not defend it. Thirdly, and this is the worst thing in my view about slavery, was the fact that slavery promoted what we can call a slave mentality in the minds of most blacks, and unfortunately that has not been eradicated to this day. Not everyone was affected this way. The truth is that many Southern blacks were very industrious, amazing stories about their ingenuity. I think now of a man who was a very prominent artisan and sought after all over the South for his work. And many Southern homes to this day, if they're still standing, have work done by this particular slave, a master craftsman. And he was a very wealthy man because his master allowed him to travel all the time. And he would also pay his master a proportion to kind of pay him back, because he never worked at the plantation, or when he did work at the plantation, he was paid for that. But then he traveled all over the South doing work, and his master allowed it. There were many stories like that of very industrious, brilliant, gifted black men, and I wish those were the men that were honored in Black History Month. And I wish those were the men that had a day named after them, not the man that has a day named after them. It's demeaning to blacks to have that man as a hero. But there are many men who are worthy of our honor, and I will give them honor. Not everyone imbibed the slave mentality, but I have to say most of them did. And this is the saddest thing. Why is it that most of the people who are interviewed in the slave narratives wish that they were back in slavery? You see, that is problematic to me. I mean, that does indicate something about how attractive their life was. But it makes me sad that they want to be slaves again, you see. They shouldn't. And ironically, if slavery had not been so pleasant an experience, they wouldn't have wanted to be back in it. But you see, the fact, and this is the strange thing, because planters tried to do what I think Christian men ought to do, that made slavery not an unattractive option. They didn't do, in other words, the failure of the South is seen more in this than any other area. They did not train these people to live as responsible men and women like we should have. And as a consequence now, the majority of the black race still believe that someone ought to take care of them. And finally, slavery gave occasion for the radical revolutionaries to increase the size and power of the federal government to undreamed of proportions. The nation, after 1865, as we shall see, was an entirely different place. The nation established by the Founding Fathers was destroyed. The nation of the new revolutionaries, however, became a nightmare for the freed black men and women after the war. The laws which ostensibly were passed to help them have consistently excluded them from the privileges they once enjoyed under the restricted freedom of slavery. Here's the irony. Their freedom has resulted in more slavery than the slavery did. Think about it. Licensure requirements are horrible. The rise of unionism has systematically excluded black artisans and craftsmen from making the living they once made before the war. I was just in New York City. You know what a taxi medallion costs now in New York City? You have to buy them. They're not issuing anymore. The city in its wisdom says we don't want to do that. And so now they're passed on as great legacies because it costs you upwards of anywhere from $250,000 to $500,000 to get one. There are many black men in New York City who would love to drive a taxi, but because of the wise, modern, compassionate government we have, they can't get a job driving a taxi because they don't have $500,000 to buy a license, a medallion to run a car in New York City. Yeah, it's a great place. The welfare laws have removed the black man from his position of breadwinner and head of the home, and the black family has been destroyed. And I'm furious about the fact that these men who pass these laws then turn around and accuse us of bigotry. Blacks were freed from the southern plantation only to become slaves of an impersonal state. Professors Fogel and Ingerman observe this, and this is an amazing statement. He says what anti-slavery critics generally objected to was not the fact that slavery constrained the opportunities open to blacks, but the form under which these constraints took place. Physical force was not acceptable to them. Legal restraints were acceptable to them. And the abolitionists who were opposed to the forcibleness of Southern slavery had no qualms about passing legal restraints against free black men and women in this country. And that is infuriating to me. Henry Banner, I will quote you one of my friends from the narratives. Henry Banner, former slave from Arkansas, put it this way. He said, before the war, you belonged to somebody. After the war, you weren't nothing but a nigger. And that upsets me. But in spite of the evils of the system, we cannot overlook the benefits of slavery. And I will say there were many benefits for black as well as white. The first benefit was the influence of Christianity. More than one slave lived to thank God for slavery. Despite the hardships involved, Martin Jackson from Texas made this statement as he spoke to a white interviewer. I believe that slavery in this country, taking everything into consideration, was a godsend for the slaves. The 20 million Negroes are descended from 4 million sent over from Africa. And if it had not been for the slave trade, we would still be living in Africa. I would be a heathen, and my children would be heathens. More than one former slave was able to stand, as it were, with Joseph and say, men meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And slavery they were delivered from in Africa was a far worse slavery than anything they suffered in this country. Please remember that the slaves that were traded from Africa were already in slavery in Africa. Black slave traders in Africa made hundreds of thousands of dollars by trading captives of other tribes that they had captured. It was a horrifying thing, the whole thing, but that was done under the U.S. flag, not the Southern flag. That was done under the Dutch flag and the Portuguese flag, not the Southern flag. The Southern Constitution outlawed the slave trade, contrary to the U.S. Constitution. Slavery produced, and here's a second blessing, of genuine affection between the races that I say has never existed in any nation before the war or since. It is unique almost in the history of the world that two races lived in such close proximity with such a high degree of mutual affection and peaceableness. There will never be this kind of relationship brought on by the civil rights movement. Listen to some of these things. I hope I can read this. I can't read some of these things. It simply breaks my heart to think about what we've lost here. Let me read you some of these. George Fleming from Lawrence, South Carolina. I long to see Marsh Sam Fleming. Lord, child, that's the best white man that ever breathed the good air. I still goes to see where he's buried. And every time I get the chance to venture towards Lawrence, and as old as I am, I still drop a tear on his grave, for he sure was good to me and all his other niggers. Clara Davis from Alabama. They tells me that when a person crosses that river, the Lord gives him what he wants. And I done told the Lord I don't want nothing much, only my home, white folks. And I don't think that's much to ask. And I suppose he'll send me back there. I've been waiting for him to call. Adeline Johnson from Winsboro, South Carolina. I hope and praise to get to heaven. I'll be satisfied to see my Savior that my old master worshipped and my husband preached about. I want to be in heaven with all my white folks, just wait on them and love them and serve them, sort of like I did in slavery time. That will be enough heaven for Adeline. there's a nobility here that humbles me, and I think ought to humble us all. Nicey Pugh made this statement. She said, I was born a slave, but I ain't never been one. I was a worker for good peoples. Now, you wouldn't call that a slave, would you, white folks? You see, no one need lament the passing of slavery. But who cannot lament the damage that has been done to black and white as a result of abolition? We are forced to say that in many ways the remedy was far worse than the disease ever was. The issue of slavery provoked a revolution in 1861. It provoked a true hatred that has yet to die down. It is time for us to stand and declare the truth about slavery and to expose the failure of abolition. And not only this, but we must go forth and proclaim the only truth that can set all men free from slavery, the truth of the Lord Jesus Christ and the gospel. We'll stop there.